All right, so let's get started. So hopefully most of you were at Professor Pyrooz's lecture. I won't go so far as to summarize it, but a lot of what we're going to be doing here is going to be based on what he just talked about. We invited Professor Pyrooz to give the lay of the land in his very objective scholar mode. And then this session is going to be more about what should we do about it. So we can build on the knowledge we gained and hopefully here start working on turning that into action. So whoops. All right, so here's what I would like to do. First, I'm going to talk a little bit about model legislation generally, a proposed framework that I want to present, and then I want to have a discussion. And that means I want to hear, hopefully from you guys. I want to use this as a brain trust to brainstorm how to fill in this framework that I've been working on building. And then after that, we'll see if we've built some consensus. So one of the reasons I wanted to be a part of this conference is I had a conversation with a legislator in California, Dr. Shirley Weber, who's now our Secretary of State. And she really encouraged me to try and call together a conference of the right people, without thinking through who that was in our original conversation, get them together to put themselves and their ideas and their names behind some good ideas, and then bring those back to her. So when I imagined what that looks like in practice, what I thought about was first, and Dr. Pyrooz mentioned this a little bit, there was something called the Euro Gang Conference that happened amongst criminologists, I don't know, a decade or two ago. And they had a session where they said, okay, we are going to come up with a definition of gangs that is the consensus of criminologists. And then we're going to encourage everybody to use that definition. And hopefully that will just end all of the decades of arguments at that point over defining what is and what isn't a gang. It didn't work entirely, but it had a profound effect. So I thought, okay, what would that look like for us? It would look like, I think, model legislation on anti-gang laws. All right. Well, here's the problem you immediately run into with that. A great many of us, myself included, would probably start with a blank, a blank statute, and then stop right there. The point is not to come up with a really good anti-gang, a suppression strategy law, some penal code that properly stops gang violence, because most of us really think the criminal justice approach to gang suppression is sort of inherently flawed. Well, so what could we do? There's another issue that immediately came up when I started thinking about this, which is all of the debates I have had, which have been really important in developing my thinking, but have been very counterproductive in terms of getting things done sometimes. And that is the debate between abolition and reform. So wanting to build consensus, I was trying to think, how do we create a framework that recognizes both people interested in, I don't like to say the word reform, I like to think about tangible, immediate benefits to impacted people. And what those look like sometimes are small steps towards reform. But also recognize that abolition of prisons, or at least of gang suppression, overly punitive gang suppression, is a valid, and I share that as an ultimate goal. All right, so here is the general idea I came up with. And if any of you are ever, let me first talk a little about model legislation in general. So for those of you who have never worked with legislation, legislators are obviously not content experts. So when I was in law school, the best class I took in my entire 3 years of law school was a class called How to Change the Law. It was taught by a former state senator, and what I learned from him first and foremost is that legislators first don't know the content of the issues that they're supposed to legislate. Second, even those who are lawyers really don't spend any time thinking about statutory construction or whether the text of their laws will actually get done what they want to do, right? They sort of turn that all over to other people. Sometimes it's legislative counsel, which is the lawyers that work for the legislatures, but often it is to people who are content experts and who care about the issues. So in criminal justice reform, that often means the ACLU or other groups that will bring a statute already written. Now, model legislation is also used quite a bit by the right and by corporations. So many people know about ALEC, the American, I forget what it's called, Legislative Something Council, right? They're responsible for the stand your ground laws around the country, which they wrote up as model legislation and had introduced around the country. The private prison laws came out of this sort of model legislation. So it has good and bad side, but it's if you want to really get something enacted, you've got to start with something that was written outside of the legislative process. I'll tell you one more story, I think, which is really relevant to this particular session, which is AB 333. So AB 333 is a bill that's currently being considered by the California legislature. It began really in the Committee for Revision of the Penal Code, which was a committee that was created by the governor to study what are the major flaws, big picture, in the penal code and what reforms could really be made. And they considered enhancements for the first year, gang, gun, 3 strikes, all the different sort of enhancements. Spent one of their sessions focused on gang enhancements. We presented, and they said they wanted to do something important on this. Senator Cam Logger, who will be our plenary speaker tomorrow, was on that committee and was sort of anticipated to introduce some legislation. So after that session, I didn't hear anything. I was one of the people who presented as an expert to that committee. We didn't hear anything. So I started saying, well, let me come up with some ideas of how we put what we discussed into practice, into language. I emailed them to the committee. Next time I heard back, several months later, I see that a bill has been entered in the legislature, and it has the text from my email. And that was really just supposed to be a conversation starter. It was not completely thought through. It was definitely not my intent to say, this is what the law should say. And since then, I think all of the language I maybe first put in that email has been removed through the various iterations. But if we had started with a fully thought through piece of legislation, the whole process since then of dealing with the law enforcement lobby, of making concessions to scared moderate Democrats who sit on important committees, right? That whole process would have worked much, much better had we had a piece of model legislation. So, it's too late for AB 333 to begin with this, but I am actually pretty confident that AB 333 will be followed, maybe not immediately, but at some point with another piece of legislation. So maybe this will help guide that. And then we saw, as we saw from Professor Pyrooz, there are 44 other states that are in need of something like this. Okay, so now we can take a look at sort of my broad proposal. So if any of you have ever taught, you might recognize this right away. This is sort of a standard rubric we find in education. You grade things on a 1, 2, 3, or a 4. 1 is far below expectations, 4 exceeds expectations. And I first saw this sort of classic high school rubric being used in policy when I was at the Urban Peace Institute. And one of the things that UPI would do is visit a city, invited in, and analyze where they were in terms of a comprehensive response to community violence. And a 1 would be, most people say it doesn't exist, but it does. There's no coordinated response, and you have a lot of people sort of working by themselves outside of the system to address it, some good, some bad, or or some effective, some ineffective, right? So that might be a 1. And a 4 is a comprehensive, prevention, intervention, suppression scheme where the suppression is accountable to the communities, where you have a centralized organization ensuring that the suppression and the intervention forces aren't at odds with each other, bringing in, all of that. So that would be a 4. So I was thinking, well, what would this look like if we took this sort of approach to gang laws, right? And the far below expectations would be a combination of the worst of all Step Act type anti-gang laws. And if you were in the last session, you saw that means, a definition of gangs that's overbroad, a nexus between prosecution and the gang that is loose if it exists at all, that it says it punishes gang participation, but it's so broad, and in practice that means anything done by a gang member is gang participation. What are some of the other really bad problems? All crime is just immediately enhanced. So a misdemeanor can get you a year in jail, or a low-level felony can get you 15 years in jail. And and we heard King Tone during his plenary this morning talk specifically about his nonviolent medium level, I'll say, drug offense landed him with over a decade in prison. So that's the worst. The best would be just a repeal, right? We have 5 states that have no gang laws. That might be the best. And in between, we have maybe levels of, AB 333 is really trying to move, we started trying to move California from 1 to 3. In practice, we're probably moving from a 1 to a 2. Now there are other states who are already at a 2, and and the question is, what's politically possible? Could we move from a 2 to a 4? If that's the case, then pay no attention to the 3. But if you are at best at a 1, hoping to move to a 2, which may be where California is right now, for example, or move to a 3, let's not talk so focused or be so focused on repeal that we end up with thousands of people every year being sentenced to a prison sentence that is expensive, that is unhealthy for them, that will help. We heard a little bit about increased control of gangs in prisons, making prisons less rehabilitatory, and when they get out, make their chances of successful reentry lower, right? Okay. And then I wanted to add one more idea to this, and that's also something that came up before, which is, let's add a 5 to this, which is replacing this with something better. Professor Pyrooz talked about this in terms of all the existing laws are anti-gang laws. And what are we for? Not just what we're against, but what are we for? In California, we've talked a little bit about funding intervention. We have the CalVIP program, for example. So what is it that states can do that will actually help? We heard about King Tone's program this morning. How can states support work like that? Okay, so that's the proposal. What I first was hoping to do, and again, this is supposed to be a brain trust, and also a chance to work towards consensus. So what I would like to do now is ask people to unmute themselves. Hopefully that won't be a problem, and talk about whether you think this is going to distract us from where our focus needs to be, which is abolition, whether you think this is an effective balance between reform and abolition. Let's start with that big picture. Does this framework work for you, either in your organizing work or in your legal work? Oh, I'll say one more thing, which is I am fine with uncomfortably long silences. I find that's just a necessary thing to get people to speak. So be prepared to suffer while we wait for somebody to get the courage to believe that their voice is valuable enough to be heard. Because it is, all of you have voices that are valuable enough to be heard. So All right. So what do you guys think? Is this a good start?
You know, I'm always going to feel a silence, Sean. So I will definitely. Um, I, I I do like and agree with the fact that there has to be something, a process like this one, because you know abolition doesn't happen overnight. It just doesn't and can't, and it will never happen without another process. Um, and I think that this is a well thought out process. So yeah, I agree with it.
Yeah, Colleen, go ahead.
When you were talking about the model legislation, I recall the creation of the Constitution, and Madison came with the draft in hand. And by and large, that's the document that we have. He was able to set the agenda because he provided the framework. And I operate a lot in my own personal practice under the premise that people are lazy. And if you can give to them something that they were supposed to do, your example of the email that became law, or the proposed law, is a classic example of that. So I'm a utopian idealist, so I'm just constantly living in a case of disappointment, and setting low expectations kind of helps to temper that. But it doesn't seem to, the more I'm disappointed, the more I just want to push back and against the pendulum swing. And I see, you know, at like the pendulum example, if you pull it all the way to one side and let it go, it's gonna, you know, swing right, you know, back to the other. So that was the comment in a prior forum about the overreaction versus the underreaction. But where we need to end up is without swings back and forth, with some common consensus and agreement as to what is a society we're, what society we want to live in. So I'm always going to be shooting for number 5.
Yeah, this is Jose. Yeah, I love it, man. I mean, I'm just excited this year that, you know, AB 333, although it's not perfect, you know, but we made it this far, you know, because, you know, gang laws kind of fall, as far as the public understands them, you know, they kind of fall under that category of like sex offenders and serial killers. And so because of that, you know, gang laws or gang members or any of that, you know, stuff, you know, it's the only real time where, you know, racism is accepted, or prison and jails, you know, harsh punishment is accepted, you know, because in most people's imaginations, you know, that are kind of outside some of the work that we do and why we're here today, but in most people's like conscious mind, you know, there, it's not inclusive of those people, of so-called gang members, you know, as far as you know, bettering the community or changing the system and stuff like that. And so, you know, I'm down with it for sure. And you know, I do understand that it's for sure going to be a process, not going to be easy, and happy we came this far.
This is Babe Howell from the East Coast. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes. I was hoping to hear from someone from New York. I was going to call him Alex too, if he isn't the next one to talk.
I can't see myself for some reason, but
we can see you.
so in New York, we don't have any gang laws. There's no state definition of gangs. There's no enhancements. There's no gang offenses. The only gang offense is one that's like a 3 or more gang assault, which doesn't involve a gang. It's just 3 or more people. And that makes me feel strongly that the goal has to be replaced with something better, because we don't have gang laws, but they just bring in gangs as motive, or gangs as part of the basis for conspiracy or RICO charge, and they can still stack things up in really, really pernicious ways. So they don't need, you don't need special laws. And I'm sure our New York prosecutors would be happy to kind of school California if you ever did get rid of the Step Act. So I do think it's very important to embrace the notion that gang prosecutions are racist and shouldn't exist under any, it's just an allegation that shouldn't come into court. And when I think about replacing with something better, yes, resources and approaches in the community, but also it strikes me as in these cases, there's no real place to look at mitigation, like gang membership. When I look at the, backgrounds of so many of the people that they're pulling in, it's like folks whose families have been deported, folks who have families have been incarcerated, folks who have been shuffled around the system, who have not been given educational support. So it feels to me like there may be a world of saying, the something better is if a person is associated with a gang, that is a sign that there may be serious mitigation and there should be extra hoops before you even charge that person. Right? Anyway, that's what I've been thinking about these days. And the other thing is that strikes me in these cases is self-defense. This just doesn't exist. They say this is a senseless rivalry. It's like if somebody shoots at me and then I shoot at them, that would be self-defense for me. So there's a couple of different issues where it feels like once they put this label on you, you have, you lose defenses, you gain propensity evidence, which is highly prejudicial, and that we need a set of rules around this because we're triggering such extreme bias and extreme racialized bias in our society.
So if you're looking at the screen, it got a little messed up, but I plan to take notes on the conversation. So hopefully you can see the first box would be, what does a 2 look like? The second one's a 3 look like. And the third box here is what does a 5 look like? I'm trying to take notes, and please help me if I am getting it wrong. Wow, I see Alex has given us a whole bunch.
So these are the conclusions of the report that Josmar Trujillo and I wrote about the gang policing situation in New York City, and the link to the report is above the list of recommendations. So as Babe mentioned, we don't have specific gang laws, so we're certainly not interested in creating any. And what we're interested in is trying to get cities to quit using the discourse of gangs, to quit saying the word even, because that in and of itself includes a whole set of understandings that legitimate suppression policing, that legitimate the dehumanization of people. And so we have violence problems, we have youth unemployment problems, we have broken family problems, we have, runaway youth problems, right? Let's address those problems in positive, proactive ways. The idea that we need to give the police some kind of watered down set of tools, that's slightly better or less repressive just doesn't make any sense to me, because the police will just run wild with whatever we give them, because anything we give them legitimates the idea that this is an appropriate role for police. So, and I'm not worried about the long-term issue here. The long-term issue is they will continue to use police to attack people until we put in place the alternatives. So we have to put all of our energy into divesting from policing and creating a whole set of alternatives that directly address the needs of young people.
So this is great. I knew with the brain trust idea, right? I'm glad you're here, Alex, because right away you were able, I think, to fill in this last box quite a bit. But I also think that what you just raised is what I was asking about earlier, which is this framework. Well, you just said we had to put all of our resources into ending this sort of state violence. So would you, I mean, how would you characterize, like I said, I and several people on this call right now are working on AB 333, which will at best move us from what I say is a 1 to what I say is a 2. But even that, I think, 1,000, 5,000 people may end up without gang enhancements next year. How do we reconcile those two ideas?
Well, I understand that you have existing legislation that is terrible. But what you're running the risk of doing is reducing gang enhancements for 5,000 people and then making it impossible to do anything about the other 100,000 people. Because now you've legitimated the basic framework that they are using to engage in this mass criminalization. So I understand the desire to win something concrete. To me, winning something concrete is, abolishing the use of the gang database, or significantly, cutting the funding for gang units, or other kinds of steps that don't re-legitimate the fundamental idea of gang suppression policing, so-called, non-reformist reforms. So I do not support these issues to create, slightly better gang suppression policing.
Is there anybody else who wants to talk on that?
I do, if I may.
Yes, please.
Yeah, and I want to make sure I was clear on what I was saying earlier, because I strongly agree with Alex. When I'm thinking in terms of repealing and replacing legislation, I'm talking about replacing it with legislation that really changes the structure in the way that Alex is. So I think that that's really important. But if I may just take a step back from that, the things that Alex is talking about is it's so clear. Of course, this is what we need to do. There's no question about it. The thing I think that we are missing, and we talked about this a little earlier in the Kumo space, is that, legislators don't look at this and say, oh, yes, this is the right thing to do. I'm going to do it. Okay. They are pressured merely because the narrative has changed in the public space. And because of that change in the narrative, the public, those voters, put the pressure on their legislators. And so what I think is missing in discussions like this is, how do we not only reframe the narrative so that it is accurate and appropriate, but how do we get that message out to the wider public, and more specifically voters? And I think we miss that step every single time. And that's why it is very hard for us to become effective in changing legislation. We are so naive that we really think that legislators are just nice people, and that if we just explain it to them hard enough, logically enough, they'll see the light and they will vote in the right way. I think that's terribly naive, and I personally, in my experience, know that not to be true.
This Alex, well, I certainly agree with that. I mean, our Gangs Coalition is focused on doing grassroots public education. So we are constantly doing events in person, webinars, producing reports. We're buying advertising. We're doing stuff on social media because we have to build a base for these ideas. And we're working with legislators to develop, alternative frameworks for thinking about how to address shootings in their community. So yes, we're not going to win this on either technocratic grounds or on heartfelt appeals. We have to build a base of political power.
So, all right, we're getting maybe a little off the question, but I want to pursue this a little bit. My feeling is that yes, elected legislators, for the most part, are really thinking about how to maintain their popularity and not about whether or not a reform or a repeal or whatever is effective. However, that's not always been my experience, both with staffers. It's not been my experience with scared but well-meaning moderate Democrats. And it's not always been my experience with the last couple governors. Whereas there are a great many times when they see a bill, they have something brought to them and they say, you know what, this looks good, but I want to make sure it's not going to come back and bite me later. I want to be confident that if we do this smart justice thing that you're suggesting, that I will be able to later point to it as an example of something that worked. And that requires a certain amount of making good arguments. And with the moderate Dems, we find ourselves sitting across from the DA's Association or the Police Chiefs Association with an on the fence, Democrat or their staffer in the room. And they're listening to the debate between us. And they're really on the fence because, those political pressures, there's always sort of a center point where there's somebody who's like being pulled both ways at once. And I think making good arguments can sway those people. Certainly when the law enforcement are exposed for being just complete, liars, it has been helpful in winning votes.
It looks like you have Michelle Pena's hand up for a while.
Oh, okay. Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, Michelle, let me hear from you.
Oh, I just wanted to share, I do some amicus work and also advocacy, legislative advocacy with the Pacific Juvenile Defender Center. And so that just brought to mind how there's a lot of laws or proposed laws that are suggested to the legislature that may not say anti-gang, but in the end result, it's preventing gangs from even formulating or the effects of gangs. So like maybe part of the solution is like your number 5, replacing with something better, what are we, talking about intervention, working with the youth. I think there's a lot that goes under the radar because of, confidentiality of juveniles, juvenile cases. And I think, where are they being housed is important. Who in the foster system, who are the foster parents? There's a lot of, the at-risk youth. What are we doing for them? And how can we support them so that they don't end up on these lists as they get older, or, get involved with, associate with a certain group of people that is identified by, law enforcement as being, potentially gang members. So I think part of that is having a collaboration and supporting other groups that have the same ideal. Because sometimes I think there's so many of these little offsets that are, they're all for the same purpose in the bigger scheme of things. But because we get into the nitty gritty about which law we want to change, instead of supporting each other, that might be something that we could consider. Just what else is happening already that has the same result, or potentially the same result that we want. And I did want to mention that the closure of the DJJ is huge. I mean, that's going to change how our youth perceive the prison system, instead of like, it's, to me, it's just like prison junior, you know, having that DJJ system, it's just priming our youth to feel comfortable in a prison-like situation, as opposed to having community-based resources, trauma-informed.
Let me stop you 1 second, just because I'm afraid you're going to lose a lot of people here who aren't from California.
Oh, okay.
The DJJ is our like juvenile prison system. It's being closed down as we speak, and all of the young people who are in the DJJ system are being sent back to the counties to be basically be placed in something new. And each county is coming up with something new.
Yeah, so, and that's the key part. Each county is coming up with something new, and that's the place where we can work, where, you know, we can throw in our support, that, you know, having a certain community-based program, as opposed to being more of this high secure, restrictive, you know, instead of the state controlling it, it's the county controlling it, kind of mini DJJ. So looking to see what's happening on a micro level and then supporting those groups. So thank you.
So, whoops.
I've got my hand up too.
Oh, sorry. I thought that was from before. Yeah, go ahead, babe.
So just another thought. I mean, I definitely for the Alex approach, you know, kind of, and better than all this, none of the above, but as a criminal defense lawyer, I also do see, you know, the value of a bifurcation requirement and higher, you know, advocacy for legislation that improves your status quo, especially if it can involve the kind of organizing, you know, where gang members come into it as well. And I'm not sure about your current legislation, which still kind of leaves gang, you know, it could lead to a gang enhancement, but I definitely see the value of legislation as something that mobilizes a lot of people. Like, they want a law for something. It's a good way to get people in and involved and working on testimony and working on how these things affect the community. So I might want to get a law, you know, work more towards number 5, but I can see the value of, you know, a number 2, 3 in terms of improving the lot of, you know, folks going through the criminal justice system. Because right now, if your prosecutor decides to throw in that gang charge, you're really, you know, screwed, excuse my language.
Yeah. You know, I see mono, it keeps coming up, connecting to audio for you, but I would love to hear from you at some point if you're actually able to get in on this conversation. Okay, but
Romo has
Lisa, yes, Lisa, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, Sean, as you know, I go back and forth about an incremental approach. I mean, I have serious concerns about it, and yet I am involved in it. But I think that, you know, my experiences with the death penalty, I've been a death penalty lawyer for 30 years, and we haven't been successful at, you know, abolition, right? But we now have 3 or 4 people being sentenced a year, and we used to have 40 people sentenced to death a year. So incremental change has worked in the sense of we've been able to change the narrative over these last 3 decades, and prosecutors have gotten to the place where it's no longer valuable for them to go after a death verdict. It doesn't get them anything. And so I think that incremental change could be very valuable in the gang context because we're a long way, I realize, from abolition, from getting, rid of the STEP Act, much less replace it with something better. But I think it has to go hand in hand with changing the narrative. And that's where we have not been successful because, as one of the speakers from yesterday said, we're so siloed. And I don't know if all of us are siloed, but certainly I am. I'm a criminal defense lawyer. I've been arguing for decades against the gang laws. I've been pointing out sociological research. I've been pointing out there's no empirical support. And, I get the courts are like, yeah, whatever. They just don't want to hear from me. So we have to create something bigger than that. And we have to start changing the narrative so the pressure builds on the prosecution, on the legislature, to go beyond incremental reform. And I think that can happen. And I think, as Andrea just said, or is it Babe, this first step is, it may not get us a whole hell of a lot, but it gets legislators involved in understanding the process, and we haven't done enough of that, and we need to do more. And maybe we can learn a lot from what New York is doing with their project. And I hope that's what comes out of this conference.
I'm glad you brought up the death penalty, because I keep thinking about the work I've done on gang databases in terms of, has this incremental approach paid off? And we can certainly show that the number of people in Cal Gang has gone from 200,000 to under 50,000. But I think there are still 200,000 people probably in law enforcement gang databases other than Cal Gang in California still. So I think gang databases work in California supports Alice's argument even more than my own. But I think the death penalty is a good point. Okay, so we definitely don't have consensus around this incremental idea, but that's not to say that it's not potentially the right idea, or still supported by a lot of us. I think we do have a lot of consensus around the ideas of what should be in the replace, in the 5 column, as I'd called it originally. So a lot of these I summarized out of the New York work, but I want to dig down on one thing, which is, I think we have consensus about a lot of these things, but maybe not all of them. So first, the focused deterrence. So the New York recommendations included 1, no focused deterrence, precision policing, but at the same time, suggested that there should be investment in outreach. Let me make sure, what did you guys use? The credible messenger language? Yeah, credible messengers, things like that. So to be clear, right, when I hear focused deterrence, precision policing, I think David Kennedy. And his approach, pulling levers that we need to, at one hand, surveil people to see whether or not they might be victims or offenders, because that's the same group of people. And then we need to hammer them with suppression. At the same time, we offer them services. And I think what we're saying is that the heavy-handed, we're going to bring the hammer down on you unless you do right, we can eliminate that and still keep the other lever, which is, in my mind, reentry services. That's what we call them usually in California. Street outreach, gang intervention, credible messenger work, the kind of stuff we heard from Tom earlier today. Is that right? Do I have that sort of, is there consensus around that?
Yeah, focused deterrence has just been a horrible program here in New York and in most other places. And it's almost entirely punitive, and it's all about a police and prosecution-centered strategy. And then they dress it up with a few social services, which whenever we look closely, it turns out to be almost nothing. It's like a referral phone number, they give people. It's a lot of finger wagging, etc. So the idea, though, that you could have targeted interventions, that of course makes perfect sense, but just keep police and prosecutors out of it.
Yeah. Okay. I think we're all on the same page with that. I'm looking at the list. Hopefully you are too. The large gang takedowns. That was the one other thing that gave me pause. Now, when I think of everything I know about the raids in New York, of the housing projects, you know, especially, well, I know almost entirely everything I know comes from Professor Howell's work. But everything I know about that is like, yeah, I'm absolutely opposed to that. At the same time, my experience, thank you, it's in the chat, the Bronx 120 report. At the same time, I have had experiences here in Los Angeles where there are large gangs who have the vast majority of the people in the gangs are people who I feel very comfortable with and comfortable with them being part of my community. And then there's a small number of people who are extremely violent and are looked to as leaders by their peers. And when those people are removed from the group, man, everything is cool in the neighborhood. Those people come back out of prison and man, everything goes to hell and people die over it. And that there have been targeted, usually, you know, in LA, they're always federally involved takedowns. You know, usually they're involving the sort of the key drug operators that are not the entire gang, but operate within a gang. And I think that they have saved lives. So maybe we can talk a little bit about maybe where we do have consensus or not around that issue. And
Can I ask a question about? Can I ask a question about those takedowns though? Because are they that targeted? Is it just the actual bad guys, or do they throw in a few others that they don't like because they sing and because they are video stars? And see, that's what I see in these takedowns. Is like, oh, you know, there's 2 or 3 people that you should charge in state court with whatever, you know, with the shooting, with the attempted murder, with the murder. But then there's another 2, 3, 5 or 10 who are, you know, associates or people that the cops just don't like. We see that a lot, especially around musicians.
Yeah, so the one case I worked really closely on, which is always the one that I have in my mind first, it was a Marta Salvatrucha federal raid. The reason I was so involved in it is they arrested my friend Alex Sanchez, who is one of the best intervention outreach workers in Los Angeles. They also picked up a bunch of kids who were involved with serious criminal activity, but were kids. In fact, one of the most heartbreaking things Alex told me at the time, I remember, was how they started playing Duck, Duck, Goose with each other while they were spending hours in holding cells. I think that really said a lot about who they were. And Alex was included just because he had a personal beef with the gang lieutenant who they brought on to help make the list of who were going to be the targets. So at the same time, yes, I've never seen one that was great, that was perfect. But Alex was found innocent. The kids are all released. And like I said, I think some lives were saved. So I don't know, you bring up a good point. Maybe I'm the only one here who's got any sort of a visceral reaction to the no large gang takedowns. I'd like to hear from other people. Oh, Andrea brought up the San Diego case. Why don't you talk about that, Andrea? Because that was also Tiny Do brought on, you know, prosecuted just for being a rapper. And I am not defending that as an example of a kind of police action I support. But why don't you share that?
Yeah, but it was really remarkably similar to what Babe was talking about.
It is.
They decided to do a very large what they called gang takedown. They cast a wide net, and two of the people that were arrested, one was merely someone whose picture was found on the Facebook page of someone who was allegedly a member of the gang, and another person was a rapper who was arrested merely because he had supposedly rapped about the gang, and even at the heart of it, it was unclear what crime in fact had been committed and whether any of the alleged gang members were even affiliated with the gang. So yeah, I mean, that was a case that fits squarely into what Babe described.
And I think in a way, Sean, even your example is saying like we shouldn't have large takedowns. Like the theory is essentially their theory for the takedown is we're going to really take a bunch of or all of the people in a gang and thereby dismantle it. And what you're really saying is, I think what the criminal justice system is supposed to be doing is like there should be individualized justice, especially when you're dealing with kids. You shouldn't be dealing with conspiracy or vicarious liability. Your parents can't tell you what to do. Your friends certainly aren't going to be able to. So, the general, like there shouldn't be gang takedowns, I think is something that you're actually, there may be some partial benefit to it. I do think that the size of them usually leaves as much damage as, like the rest of the families and people who, at least in our cases, you are pleading guilty if they pull you in. Even the one guy, two of the Bronx 120 had their cases deferred prosecution and were released on the prosecutor's consent, but one of them there was caretaking their sick mother who died while he was in for like 1 or 2 days. So the kind of like, oh, we let out the lesser involved is too little too late. So I think the model is wrong, and the concept it reifies the pathologization of the whole gang instead of there are some gang members who are bad, but the problem is violence, not the gang.
Yes. So if we talk about large takedowns against gangs defined that way, I think we have consensus on that. So what we may not have consensus about, or maybe we do, but I think we probably don't, is that and it sounds like maybe you, think that there is a place for prosecution of what I put as members of sophisticated organized criminal enterprises responsible for serious and widespread violence, and they should be prosecuted for their actual crimes or crimes they directed. Like, I feel very comfortable with limiting it that way. Now, again, in practice, does that usually happen? Not usually. But
Sean, what value are you trying to add by saying that? Prosecutors have that power already.
Yes.
They will use it the way they use it. They usually do not use it in the ways that are actually helping the community, and we certainly can't trust them. But why would we even need to speak to that? They're going to do that. Our focus should be in delegitimating this idea of criminalizing gangs, and instead constantly focused on addressing harms in positive, proactive, preventative ways.
I think you're absolutely right. I'm just bringing it up because I feel like I'm in a group of allies thinking through where we may have legitimate disagreements with each other. But you're right, and I just put that in the list. There's no reason to bring that up in general or outside. But it will help me think about how to talk about this no large takedown of gangs concept.
Hey,
So
what's up? This is Jose. I agree. It's You know, I mean, uh, it would just be great to just, at least in California, right? Like removing the step act in its entirety would like just probably be the only fix, and it would just spread a sort of wildfire in other states because of our influence in politics and what have you. Uh, but the thing is that the DAs, they just really can't be trusted with any sort of reform. Even our AB 33, they will still find a way to keep doing what they've always been doing, for sure. You know, I think if someone committed a crime, I mean, no one's abolishing at this point, you know, all felonies, you know. So someone commits a crime, you know, there'll be cops involved, there'll be investigators, and people will be found innocent, guilty, or what have you, you know. But the gang thing is just, yeah, it's just kind of ridiculous. But I understand it's, you know, it might not be an overnight thing.
So we have about 15 minutes left. So I think we've got a pretty good list over there in the 5 section. I hear all the concerns and share most of them about the idea of attach. Well, and I think maybe we shouldn't use the word model legislation as we go forward this, as this works. But that idea of like writing out a somewhat a little bit half step is probably not beneficial. But this idea of what should AB 333, for example, if another state feels that that is an achievable goal and wants to do it, what about the existing gang laws do we need to attack, to discredit, and with an eye towards how that would look like in statute? So I can start with no overbroad definitions of gangs. You know, it's 3 or more people with a sign symbol. Like, really? Like, if you give yourselves a name, that's what decides whether or not you get an extra 15 years, whether you and your friends call yourselves by a name versus just hang out. And then, you know, that the name can be the name of your neighborhood. So you don't even have to call yourselves the name. Like, the police can impose that on you. Right. So that's an example of something that I think we could criticize, and point to a specific language that's problematic. Language that is better would be much more difficult. Another thing would be we've got limit gang experts. Right. That's police gang expert. Right. They don't qualify. They would not qualify as experts in federal court most of the time. Or in civil court, or federal civil court is what I'm thinking. But yet here they are, you know, in criminal court, just talking nonsense. And also, one of the things that's driven me most crazy about AB 333 is the way when they're not in the courtroom, right, law enforcement is now just completely reversed course, right? In the courtroom, you got all these experts saying, oh, these gangs are hierarchical. They have, you know, shot callers and foot soldiers, and the Mexican mafia runs all the, you know, the Chicano Southern gangs, right? And then we get them in a room and we're talking about, well, let's put the word hierarchical in statute. And they're like, no, gangs are disorganized. There's no hierarchy to gangs. Did I say that? Right. So yeah, I mean, there's no reason to let these people into court and lie. So that was another one. Bifurcation is something we've been talked about. So all the lawyers in here probably know what that is, but for the rest of you, bifurcation means basically you have 2 trials. One trial, and this has to do with sentence enhancements for the actual crime. If you're going to try and add a gang enhancement, that has to be a separate issue. And the reason is that keeps all the prejudicial gang evidence, or hopefully most of it at least, out of that first section, even though it will then come in the second. And that allows jurors to have a better shot, at least, or the defendants have a better shot of jurors who are unbiased. So I just want to open this up to that brain trust again for at least 10 minutes on what have we heard about existing gang laws that we think we really need to highlight as being things that need to be eliminated from the law.
So Sean, if I can go to your no overbroad definition of gangs,
Mm-hmm.
and I think in the first instance, it's always upsetting to me when I see these broad definitions, but I'm going to kind of throw a monkey wrench in this and say, in some ways, I want it to actually be broader. Whenever
Oh.
I see the term street gang, I become furious. You know, it's like, why do we think it's okay to limit this to street gangs? You know, what about the way RICO developed and was used? You know, it was developed to be against the mafia, but then they realized, no, well, other types of groups do this. So, you know, I think if we certainly limited the law, limited the definition in some ways, but broadened it to include things other than street gangs, so to speak, and we start, you know, going at it from the other way. Well, why aren't you, you know, why aren't you prosecuting these other groups of individuals that are doing the same thing? You know, and so it kind of attacks it from both ways. So I know that that's kind of a different way of thinking about it, but you know, just wanted to throw that out there.
No, I think that's a great way to avoid defining gangs at all, right? I mean, that is the way the law is supposed to work. You're not supposed to prosecute people for their identity or for the groups that they're members of. You're supposed to prosecute them for their criminal activities.
And it kind of speaks to what Alex is talking about, because I do agree with it. I mean, it infuriates me that we're okay with baking in the identity of Black, brown individuals, probably of a lower socioeconomic level, that we're okay with putting that in a definition, because I'm not okay with that at all.
Actually, I don't even think we need to put that in there. Okay. What other thoughts do people have about what is most odious and subject to attack in the existing gang laws? Oh, I see two people with raised hands. David.
Yeah, John, one of the things that I was thinking of that was from the presentation, you know, given the suppression heavy focus on this, and it's not the odious part of this, but one thing that it would be a suggestion on my part that maybe hasn't been completely fully thought through, but would be mandated referrals to social service agencies when criminal justice generally seeks to apply any sort of specialized laws directed to gang populations. And this doesn't matter if it's entry into a gang database, if it's any instance of applying sentencing enhancements, whenever it is being used, that it would then get handed off towards a social service agency. And instead of thinking it as an opportunity to punish, it would be thinking about it as an opportunity to intervene. That usually when you know gang members are coming to the attention of law enforcement or getting referred to prosecution, there's usually some sort of crisis. And Babe Howell made the point of, you know, gang affiliation should be a signal that should warrant extra mitigation, but also not just about mitigation in the courtroom, but it would also be mitigation if it's in a community setting, or in the event that incarceration occurs, it would also be mitigation that's taken place, you know, whether they're in jail or being referred to prison. So just a thought to share at this point.
That's great.
I would have a big caveat on that one and leave out the when they're getting put into a gang database, because that's entirely police driven and it can lead to, you know, enforced supervision sorts of situations. So, you know, maybe if there's going to be a prosecution or an arrest or an enhancement sought, yes, but where there's, you know, just entering people into the police database, at least here in New York, they do that without really signs that you are a gang member, just because they see you associating with someone else or hanging out in the area near your home, or, you know, liking things on social media. So I don't think that's trigger enough for the vulnerabilities.
Can I also add
Yeah.
something on with that?
Quick, but then I see Lisa and Michelle both have their hands up, and
Okay,
I don't know who raised first.
Yeah, let Lisa and Michelle go, and then I'll go after that.
Okay. Lisa, you're the first on my screen.
All right. I was just going to say, although David's idea in theory is a good one, anytime we let the police, law enforcement, or prosecution control the referral to services, we are asking for trouble. I mean, in the DJJ context in California, I don't know if it's still like this, but when I was representing juveniles a while ago, it's like they would be, I had a client who was put into DJJ for 2 years, and then his, getting out of gangs program was started the 2 weeks before he was due to be let out. And, for 2 years he had to be in a gang because that's the only way you could survive there. You had to pick a side. And then at the end, it was like, oh, well, we don't have the money to give you tattoo removal, but, we'll go through a few PowerPoints with you before we let you out. And that, that's useless. We all know that's useless. So
we have, I'll just say we have the same problem in Brooklyn where the cops are deciding who gets services. The prosecutor only gives services to people who are labeled a certain way. And this is a real problem.
And I am echoing what they're saying. And I think I anticipate Andrea is going to say something about the community intervention organization, because the first thing I hear when social services agencies, I think of the Child Welfare Services Program, which eventually just ends up being punishing parents for drug use. And I could see this being punishment for alleged gang activity. We have to be really careful about what programs we're encouraging. I think the end result is excellent. I think absolutely what these people need is support services, but where those support services come from is critical. So.
And yes, Michelle knew exactly where I was going because we do a similar type of work. I love the concept of what David talked about, is making sure that people get the services and support that they need. Unfortunately, when you have a state organization like social services, it almost inevitably leads to the criminal justice system. It does not work. In one of our dialogue sessions that we had this morning, we had 2 professors, and actually one of whom who had contracted with her college town to reimagine their public safety in policing. And what they did after a series of working with the community, they created a community organization led by community members to provide support and direction on low-level nonviolent crimes. And so, I think there is no question but that people don't trust government institutions, and rightfully so, that Black and brown people don't, because it is designed to lead to their criminalization. So I think we need to have a community space. And I think also what Taco was talking about yesterday in terms of we need community-based intervention, not more government.
Okay. So we have like 2 minutes left. This has been good. I knew that as long as I showed up with something that I halfway thought through, brought it to you guys, we would leave with something that was like 4/5 thought through. So, so here's, okay, so I'm not going to say that we have 100% consensus over all of these things because we just don't have time, and Zoom is not a place where I think we can do that. And, I come from an anarchist consensus-based background where, it would take us 2-3 hours from this point, till we really could all say that we have no consensus is reached. But I think we made some process towards that. So what I am going to do is I'm going to take this, I am going to write it up. I don't know where it will be published, but I'm going to take what we've done in this conversation and put it in a place where what we've just discussed and what we've come up with is accessible to more people. I would like everybody's input. So what I'm going to do is probably figure out a couple different ways to involve people in the next steps. I will probably email everybody who's registered for the conference and invite them to be part of something that's a more iterative process of going through this, probably over email. If people are interested at some point, we may have another Zoom meeting that I will host outside the conference. And I will also use this video to see who was here actually in the conversation and reach out more specifically to everybody. If I can figure out, actually, I don't know Zoom well enough to know if I can figure out who was here and who was not with the video we got, but I'll see what I can do. And with that, I just want to thank everybody. I wish I could go around the room and give everybody a chance to say something to close with, but we don't have time for that. Is there anybody though who does have any burning last thing they want to say in the last minute or two? Okay, well then I obviously found this incredibly helpful and productive, and I hope everybody else feels like they benefited from thinking through all this out loud. As you can see in the chat, there are dialogues happening in Kumo Space. I will head over there. I'm actually not sure if we're in the studio or the patio